Yeah. Well, I'm kind of on a roll with these stories about working, so I'm going to tell another one. I just had my oatmeal, so I'm all sufficiently sophisticated, and it's time now to dish the dirt on work, I guess. This isn't so much a funny story as it is kind of a story of bureaucracy, and I don't know, a person with my personality can't work in a bureaucracy, especially a government bureaucracy. We really can't. I had this job in 1988 and 1989, and what it was is I was a on-call custodian for what at that time was called the separate school board. Now it would be called the Catholic School Board. And basically what I did is I went to any school where I was needed, say if the custodian was off sick or off on leave for some reason or away on vacation, or if a custodian had quit or transferred to another place and the job had to be filled, because they had a very strong union, and there was a whole process that had to go through to hire somebody to fill a vacant position, and it took months. And in the meantime, they needed somebody to go in and do the work while they were trying to fill the position. So I get that job. I had to drive all over the place. It was furthest away I ever had to go for work, and I did this for months, was to a school in a town called Prescott. And Prescott was about 70 miles from where I lived anyway. That was the furthest I had to drive for work. That was getting into the outer reaches of the board of our school board territory before it turned into another territory, another school board. Anyway, I did find myself working in one school. It wasn't actually that far away from my hometown. It was one of the neighboring towns. I won't say where or anything. But, doing that job occasionally, our boss was, what his title was, the head of plant and maintenance. And he'd come to see us sometimes if you were working at a job at night or whatever. He'd come to see you to make sure everything was okay, especially when you first started on that job, in case you needed anything, or sometimes supplies weren't there even though they were supposed to be. There was a lot of theft went on, and whatnot. So anyway, in case you were short of anything or you had any questions or whatever, Anyway, the second night I was working at this school, he came to see me, my boss did, the head of plant and maintenance, and he found me eating my supper in the boiler room. I was working at night. And anyway, he tore a strip off me. He said, "You can't eat in here. It's against health and safety regulations," and on like that. He said, "You have to eat in the staff room." Anyway, I told him I wasn't comfortable to eat in the staff room, and he said, "Well, you're a member of staff, and you can't eat in here." He said, "That room is as much yours as it is anyone else's." So he said, "You're to eat in the staff room, not in here. Don't let me come here and find you eating in here again." He said, "If an inspector came in here and caught you doing this, we'd all be in trouble." So anyway, the following night, I'm eating my lunch in the staff room, like I'd been told to, and a couple of teachers walked in. They were two ladies, that taught in the school, and they sat down at a table, and when they came in, I nodded and said hello, and they said hello, so they knew I was there. And they sat down at a table, and they started having a conversation about a student. And they said the kid's name and everything, but it didn't mean anything to me. I didn't know who he was. But anyway, it was a conversation of a confidential nature, though, because the student had been doing some bad things and getting into a lot of trouble. And they were describing some of the things he was doing. There was a neighbor that had property that was right there by the schoolyard, just separated by a chain link fence. And the neighbor had chickens, and the chicken coop was up against the fence, and I guess this kid had been tormenting the chickens and stuff. It was all stupid stuff like that, but he was getting into trouble, he was a little hellion, I guess. and they were talking about him. Anyway, I didn't really take much interest in it. I just finished my supper, and when I was done, I went out of the room, and I never thought any more about it. Well, the next night, my boss comes to see me again, and he ripped a strip off me. He said, "You were in there listening to a confidential eavesdropping on a confidential conversation," and on like that. And I told him, I said, I was just eating my supper, and I left in the middle of the conversation, so I certainly wasn't eavesdropping. I really couldn't have cared less about it, you know. I said, yes, I heard some things and didn't mean anything to me. And I said, I figured if it were a confidential conversation, they would have asked me to leave, in which case I would have when they came in, or they would have went to another location where they could speak privately. I said, they chose to come in and sit down and speak in front of me, so I didn't see where there was an issue. I just finished my lunch and I left. My supper, lunch, whatever, and I left. Well, he told me, he said, from now on you eat in the boiler room. You know, you don't eat in there anymore, you eat in the boiler room. So there you go. Anyway, that's what you get when you deal with a bureaucracy. Anyway, I think what happened is after those teachers had that conversation, they thought about it and they said, oh boy, you know, that guy could tell people that we were talking in front of him and we could get into trouble. And so they complained about me and basically shifted the blame to me, which often happened when you were doing custodial work. You were a staff member, yes, but you were a lesser staff member. And you were kind of looked down upon, and it wasn't, you know, you weren't an equal. You weren't an equal, and I knew that. And that's why I didn't like to use the staff room where the teachers hung out like it was my space, because I was aware of the attitude that a lot of the teachers had towards us custodians, you know, and they didn't see us as their equals. And I was sure they didn't really care for us occupying their space, you know, which they perceived as their space. And so, anyway, it turned out I was correct. Anyway, after that, I just ate in the boiler room like I was told to, you know. Anyway, that's just the story of dealing with bureaucracy. There was another time, actually, our accountant had gone off on maternity leave, and our accountant was excellent. She was really good, really efficient and everything. But she went off on maternity leave, and we got another woman in there who didn't know the job. And what happened is, I didn't get paid anymore. And I'd call her up and I would tell her, you know, I haven't received my pay again. And she kept telling me that I didn't work for the board. And I said, well, you know, look, I've been coming into the school and working every day. I said, nobody sent me home. Nobody's asked me what I'm doing there or anything. You know, you'd think somebody would have confronted me and said, hey, what are you doing? You don't work here. But nobody's done that. I said, I do work here, and I need my pay. I said, I got bills to pay like anyone else does. I can't work for free. Well, she kept insisting I didn't work there, and at one point she even threatened to call the Ontario Provincial Police on me and have them open a fraud investigation against me, because she said she figured I was trying to get paid, you know, trying to get a paycheck from them when I didn't work for them. Anyway, of course, I had to submit my papers every week. I had to submit my hours and everything, you know. There's a bunch of paperwork I had to do and submit to her every week to get paid. Had to leave that with the board office every week. Well, one day I went in to see my boss into his office, and I told him, I said, either I got to get paid or I got to find another job. And he says, what are you talking about? This was the head of plant and maintenance again. And I said, well, I haven't been paid in nearly 2 months. You know, I said, I can't deal with that woman. And, you know, he says, wait a minute, you're telling me you haven't been... He said, that's not right. He said, come with me. So I went over with him to the other building. There was the big office building, and there was an old school that the maintenance department worked out of, where my boss had his office next door to it. It was a closed-up school. Well, I went next door with him into the big office, and we went into this lady's office there, and he introduced me. He said, this man's name is Tom Fournier, and he works here. And then he pulled my papers out of the big pile of papers that were piled up on her desk. And he told me, he said, you go out of the room because I have some things to say to her, and I don't want you to hear what I'm going to say. But he said, you will get your money today. He said, you'll have your money before you leave here. So I went out of the room anyway, and I sat in the lobby. And he came out a few minutes later, and he had a check for me with all my back pay. Of course, that was a huge check, but of course that all went pretty quickly because I had to go around and pay my bills then, you know. But anyway, like I say, this is working for a bureaucracy. I knew other people that had similar problems with that accountant that they got in there to replace the one that was off on maternity leave. But yeah, when you work for a bureaucracy, this is the kind of stuff you get into anyway. You got government type stuff. And my boss himself ran into problems like that, I know. They were doing a big construction project at one of the schools, putting an addition onto it, like another wing. And I remember the local council, the municipal council of the town where the school was, they required certain documentation from the board. And there was another executive who was supposed to provide them with that documentation and didn't. And what did that guy do? He shifted the blame to my boss in the middle of a meeting between all of them. My boss knew nothing about it. He thought that the other fella had submitted the stuff. And he had to sit there and take an awful blast anyway from the municipal building inspector of that town for not doing his job when it wasn't him that had failed. It was the other guy that was over him that should have done that. So, I mean, he had his own troubles anyway, my boss did. It just seemed to go on down the line. Anyway, it's getting kind of warm out here now. I don't know if I can show you very easily what's going on.